When the scandal first broke, the atmosphere around them shifted instantly. It was not the typical noise of tabloids or online gossip. It was a wave, fast, loud, and merciless. In the US, their image became a mirror that people projected their own expectations onto. Some wanted them to represent perfection. Others wanted to see them fail. But neither Jungkook nor Jimin spoke much during that time. They stood still amid noise, each response calculated not by words but by silence and consistency. That silence became its own statement. It wasn't passivity, it was a decision. Because at that moment, speaking would have only added more fuel to a narrative that was never truly theirs. The scandal wasn't about guilt or innocence, it was about misunderstanding. The Western audience, already fascinated by their discipline and artistry, began to confront something they didn't fully grasp: authenticity that didn't rely on explanation. For weeks, American media cycled through stories, dissecting every frame, every facial expression, every lyric they performed. Yet, the more they tried to define Jungkook and Jimin through controversy, the less the image fit. Their public image had been built on work ethic, precision, and sincerity. The scandal was built on speculation. It was a clash between perception and presence. The first phase of hate came not from the scandal itself, but from how people interpreted the silence. Some believed it was arrogance, a refusal to explain. Others assumed guilt. But what no one realized then was that both Jungkook and Jimin understood something crucial. Truth has its own timing. They knew that rushing to prove themselves would make them look defensive. Instead, they waited, and the world eventually tired of its own noise. Months later, that silence began to shift from suspicion to intrigue. People started revisiting interviews, rewatching performances, and noticing that neither of them had changed their demeanor. They still smiled the same, performed with the same intensity, and carried the same energy on stage. It was as if nothing external could distort the internal. That calmness was what began to unsettle critics. By then, their shows in the US had taken a new shape. The audiences who once questioned their place began to fill arenas again, not out of sympathy, but curiosity. What made them stand there, unshaken? Why didn't the scandal consume them like it had so many others before? Gradually, America began to realize that neither Jungkook nor Jimin was fighting for forgiveness. They were performing like the scandal didn't exist, and that defiance was more powerful than any statement they could have made. In Los Angeles, a show that was initially met with tension ended up being the moment the tide turned. Jungkook's live vocals and Jimin's precision on stage reminded everyone that talent still matters. It wasn't the apology tour people expected. It was reclamation, quiet, controlled, and deliberate. When they walked off that stage, it wasn't redemption yet, but it was the beginning of something that couldn't be reversed. The American audience began to sense that the narrative around them had been exaggerated. People online started digging deeper, realizing how minor the original issue was compared to the reaction it triggered. Slowly, sympathy turned into respect, not for their image, but for their persistence. Jungkook, especially, carried an unspoken calm. The scandal could have fractured his reputation permanently. Yet, instead of trying to appear likable, he remained consistent, showing discipline in every performance and every public moment. Jimin did the same, but his approach was quieter, more introspective. Together, they projected a balance that couldn't be manufactured. They weren't reacting to hate, they were simply continuing. That's when something rare happened in American pop culture. The narrative reversed itself organically. Without media campaigns, without PR control, without interviews explaining their side, Jungkook and Jimin began to win people back simply through their output. When the public saw them performing together again, The energy felt different, no longer just polished perfection, but something raw. It wasn't about proving innocence. It was about reclaiming artistry. Every lyric, every choreography detail seemed to carry a message of endurance. The American crowd, so used to overexposure, started to notice the power of restraint. For months, neither of them engaged directly with the scandal. Yet the world kept bringing it up, trying to attach meaning to their silence. It was in that silence that they began to rebuild their image, not by denying what happened, but by creating so much substance afterward that the scandal no longer defined them. Their success in America became symbolic, not just for themselves, but for how the American audience started to evolve in understanding foreign artists. Jungkook and Jimin didn't play by the expected rules of Western celebrity culture. They didn't stage emotional interviews. They didn't dramatize their comeback. They simply stayed visible through their work. The message was subtle. Skill outlasts scandal. It wasn't a conscious rebranding. It was endurance disguised as normalcy. The power of consistency, especially in an era of constant judgment, became their most underrated weapon. Every appearance, every clip, every recording carried the same professionalism they had before. That discipline confused critics who had expected emotional collapse. Eventually, people started admitting it. They had misjudged them. The transition from most hated to most loved wasn't an overnight redemption arc. It was slow, deliberate, and almost invisible as it was happening. By the time the narrative had shifted completely, the scandal had lost its relevance. The two names that had once been attached to controversy were now attached to dominance. Their next appearances in American media reflected that change. The same outlets that once questioned their authenticity began to praise their resilience. But for Jungkook and Jimin, nothing about their approach had changed. They didn't adjust themselves to be accepted. The world simply caught up to their consistency. In the background, both of them seemed aware that survival in this industry wasn't about public approval. It was about control over expression, timing, and focus. They had mastered that balance. The more America watched, the more people understood that the scandal had only amplified what was already true about them. Their ability to perform under pressure without compromising integrity. By the time their joint recognition in the US became undeniable, a new kind of admiration had taken hold. It wasn't the surface-level excitement of a trend. It was a deeper respect, the kind earned when people realized they witnessed endurance disguised as artistry. The real story of their transition wasn't about the scandal itself, but about how they carried themselves through it. In a world obsessed with noise, they weaponized silence. In a culture that rewards confession, they chose precision. In an industry that expects spectacle, they gave substance. That is what turned hate into admiration. Because over time, people began to recognize that no PR strategy could fabricate what they had displayed. The audience in America began to shift from judgment to understanding, not because the scandal disappeared, but because the truth outlasted it. The journey from most hated to most loved wasn't redemption, it was revelation. It showed that authenticity doesn't need defense. It showed that when skill is undeniable, perception eventually corrects itself. Jungkook and Jimin didn't try to be understood, they let the work do it for them. Their story, especially in America, became less about the controversy and more about endurance. In a culture that devours fame as quickly as it builds it, they managed to create something that resisted that rhythm. They became proof that strength doesn't always roar, sometimes it just keeps going. When people look back now, What stands out isn't the scandal, but the contrast between how the world reacted and how they responded. They turned the noise into background, turned speculation into silence, and turned scrutiny into an invisible stage upon which they performed even better. That shift didn't happen because of marketing or intervention. It happened because, for the first time, audiences saw two individuals who didn't seek redemption. They simply kept doing what they were already great at. And eventually, even those who had criticized them had to admit consistency was the most powerful comeback. By the time 2025 arrived, Jungkook and Jimin had rewritten what public recovery looks like in the American spotlight. They didn't apologize for existing. They didn't reshape their artistry to appease anyone. They simply stayed. And that decision, quiet, focused, unshaken, turned what once looked like the end of their American acceptance into the beginning of something much larger. Together, they reshaped the rhythm of how public recovery looked. It wasn't about addressing every headline. It was about letting time reveal what consistency could achieve. Over months, the US media began to change its tone. Outlets that once ran sensational stories started publishing analytical pieces about their stage artistry and cultural impact. The transformation wasn't manufactured, it was earned. Their collaborations, interviews, and brand campaigns took on new meaning. When Jungkook appeared in international fashion projects, the narrative had shifted from controversial figure to unshakable artist. When Jimin's solo features started dominating charts again, critics began noting his precision and emotional discipline instead of the scandal that once shadowed him. The public started realizing something simple. The scandal didn't define them, their endurance did. The American audience, accustomed to public figures begging for acceptance, found their quiet defiance refreshing. The absence of dramatization became the proof of character that no PR statement could match. Their transformation was not the usual comeback arc. It was an evolution of presence. What once was seen as detachment began to be read as strength. What once was silence became mastery over chaos. Every new project they released felt like another layer of clarity, as if they were showing, step by step, that their foundation had never cracked. One of the most striking moments came when both of them were invited back to a US award show. The cameras captured their arrival, and instead of skepticism, there was admiration. No awkwardness, no hesitation, only the quiet authority of people who had outlasted criticism. The performance that followed was effortless, powerful, and deliberate. The crowd stood, not for apology, but for excellence. By that point, the phrase "most loved" wasn't hyperbole anymore. Their American fandom had grown again, but it wasn't built on trend-driven excitement. It was built on renewed respect. The audience that once doubted them had witnessed something that rarely happens in modern pop culture, a genuine recovery without manipulation. That's what made the shift so impactful. It wasn't just that they survived, it's that they did it on their own terms. America, a culture known for both building and breaking stars quickly, couldn't help but admire how they resisted both extremes. Jungkook and Jimin didn't beg for validation, they reclaimed it quietly through the only thing that had always belonged to them, performance. In the end, that was what sealed their legacy in the US. Not a scandal, not a headline, but their control over what came after. They taught the industry that image can be repaired, but integrity never breaks. Their silence wasn't avoidance, it was mastery. Their focus wasn't pride, it was purpose. From the outside, their story looks like redemption, but inside, it was something far more grounded. It was two artists refusing to let public noise define private truth. America fell back in love with them not because they changed, but because they didn't. Their rise after the fall proved that fame doesn't protect you, discipline does. And in the years that followed, that became the lasting lesson of Jungkook and Jimin's story in America.